Hey folks, Martin here from Mobility Direct, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how best to recharge your mobility scooter batteries so that they last as long as possible. Okay, so one of the benefits with mobility scooters is that there is very little in the way of maintenance involved with them. However, in saying that, there is one very important area, and that's the batteries. So to give you a little bit of a background, most mobility scooters are powered by two 12-volt lead acid batteries, and those batteries need to be recharged. If those batteries are recharged correctly, they should last around 2 years. If, on the other hand, they're not recharged correctly, they might only last a year or even less than that. Typically what happens is that you'll start noticing that your mobility scooter isn't travelling or driving as far as it usually does, and this in most cases is a sign that the batteries are starting to deteriorate and that you'll need to replace them soon. So to help keep your batteries in good working condition and help ensure that they last as long as possible, I'd recommend considering the following 3 tips. Okay, so tip 1. Make sure that the batteries are recharged frequently. Okay, this is a big one. Sometimes some people think that if the scooter isn't being used, they don't need to recharge the batteries. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Even if the scooter is not being used, the batteries will still lose their charge. And if the batteries go too long without getting a charge or a recharge, then those batteries will deteriorate much quicker than they should be. So a typical example, or typical situation, if you like, is that during the winter period when the weather isn't as good, people don't use their scooters as much, and then they don't charge the batteries. What happens then is springtime comes along, weather improves, people want to start using their scooters again, and now maybe the scooter isn't turning on, or maybe it's turning on but it's not driving very far. And in these types of situations, this is because the batteries have deteriorated because they weren't recharged. So as a rough guideline, I would say if you're using the scooter on pretty much a daily basis, I would recommend making sure that it gets a recharge every 2 to 3 days. If you're not going to be using the scooter for a period of weeks or months, then make sure it gets a recharge at least every 2 weeks, at least. So you might need to set some sort of reminder or an alert on your phone to do this, but it is worth doing, as you know, out of all the tips, this one is the most important. So if you don't recharge the batteries regularly, then it will cause issues with the batteries over time. Okay, so for tip 2, once you plug the charger in to recharge the batteries, make sure that you leave it plugged in for a good 8 hours. Ideally overnight. That's usually the easiest way to do it. So with the chargers that we supply with our Pride mobility scooters, it is perfectly safe to do this, and it's not going to cause any issues. I'm not going to bore you with the technical details, partly because I don't understand it myself, but essentially once you plug the charger in to recharge the batteries, it goes through different cycles or stages, and if you interrupt that process, it can cause issues with the batteries over time. So it's not a case that, let's say you just use a scooter for half an hour, so that means you just need to plug the charger in for half an hour or an hour. It doesn't work that way. So regardless of how far you've travelled on the scooter, regardless of how much charge is left, once you plug the charger in, leave it plugged in for a good 8 hours. As I said, ideally overnight. That's usually the easiest way to do this. So for tip 3, tip 3 relates to when should you put the batteries on for charge. So usually what I recommend is recharging the batteries when there's about 50 or 60% of the charge left. You know, that's usually around the optimal time to recharge. The most important thing here is, like, don't let the batteries fully deplete before recharge them. Okay, again, that can cause issues with the batteries over time. I understand that there'll be certain times or situations where you need to use the batteries as much as possible, get as much out of them, and that's fine. But if at all possible, try not to make a habit out of, you know, regularly letting the batteries deplete or nearly deplete before recharge them. If at all possible, try and recharge the batteries into about 50 or 60% or so of the charge left. You might be wondering, how will I know how much charge is left? And you can usually tell this by the battery gauge that's on the front of the mobility scooter. So an example here, this is a battery gauge from a Pride Go-Go Sport. Every manufacturer is going to have something very similar to this. So essentially, as you can see in the example here, all the lights are lit up. That indicates that the battery is at or close to 100% fully charged. So the way it works is that as you're driving the scooter, the battery will deplete, and as it does, these lights will start switching off one by one from right to left. So you can think of it like your fuel gauge. So in the next picture we can see that 4 of the green lights are switched off. That means now that scooter is in around 50 or 60%. That's how much charge is left in it. So in this next example here, we can see that nearly all the lights are out. Now there's probably 10 to 15%. If at all possible, try not to let the batteries get down to this level before recharging it. If you can at all, try and recharge them when there's about 50 or 60% of the charge left. Okay folks, so those are my 3 tips. Following these 3 tips will help ensure that your batteries last as long as possible. If you have any questions on this or anything else related to mobility scooters, then please get in touch. My contact details are below. If you like these type of videos, then please click subscribe, and I'll talk to you all again. All the best.